All right, let's continue on with Unit 9. This is the interwar years of the 1920s and the 1930s between the two world wars. Right now, let's take a look at the 1932 election. This is going to be between Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Republican Herbert Hoover. Now, overwhelmingly, the country will vote for the Democratic Party for the first time in 16 years, apparently at this point, because it was 1916 when Wilson was last as a Democrat elected. And the Republicans who had held the country as presidential administrations and won all the elections since the 1920s, well, their time had come to an end for this point. In fact, you take a look at the next few elections, for basically the better part of a third of a century, 28 of those years are going to be run by Democrats. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's get on to the 1932 election. So a lot of people are taking a look at Hoover as this guy who, and I think it's a fair statement, he did too little and he did too late. Hoover had adopted as his policy framework for dealing with what America was going to do to progress in the 1929 era through the opening of the Great Depression era as well after the stock market crash in 1929. And he names this policy framework rugged individualism. Well-intentioned, and Hoover, as a businessman and somewhat of an economist of his own rights as well, he wanted businesses to fix the economy themselves. He felt like a lot of the ills that had fallen after the stock market crash and what had happened afterwards to really be business's fault, and he's not completely incorrect in that. You take a look at what was going on with the cause of the Great Depression, from super mass production to this rise of consumerism, a lot more consumer debt, this facade idea that the stock market and that speculation was a sure win for growing money. And then you take a look at what farmers were having to deal with on how they didn't really cut back on things, and really entering the Great Depression probably 10 years earlier than most people really felt the effects of it. Yeah, Hoover didn't really understand the magnitude of the problem. He didn't understand the, let's call it, for lack of a better term, the local aspect and the feelings of the American worker at the time. And, it's, to his credit, he did do some things to kind of, at the last minute, try to build up this idea of using public money for public works projects, notably the Boulder Dam and Hoover Dam, as it would be called later. So, it's not like he was totally ambivalent of it and totally ignorant of the issues, but I still think the kind of label goes on having done too little too late. It sticks with him quite fairly. He really signs his death ticket on the election with the bonus army march as well, where you have World War I veterans coming out of the woodwork saying, hey, we'll take a smaller amount for our pension. We just want our bonuses now. Like, can we have a cut on it? Can we have something for it? And he actually has the army go and burn the tents that these veterans had actually set up outside Washington, D.C., and yeah, it doesn't look in the papers. So that's kind of the nail in his coffin, so to speak. Now, what we end up seeing also during his administration from 1929 to 1932, when he's voted out of office, we see industrial power just drop almost by half of our capacity from what it was in 1928 to 1932. That's pretty significant. We see farm good prices continue to drop, causing just serious problems and serious questions over, should we even keep farming? Who's going to buy our stuff? Can we afford to ship it anyways? There's, I think, one of the greatest causes of the Great Depression, even the global depression, if you look at it in the macro sense, is this declining foreign trade. In the 20th century, countries had specialized essentially in what they were really good at, and they found a way to make things a little bit cheaper or refine things where they had more natural resources than other countries. America was not excluded from that. Even though we have a plethora of natural resources, we don't necessarily have the capability to sit here and expect our top even 10% to buy everything that our industry could possibly produce. So we end up seeing a lot of issues with foreign trade, and especially the tariffs that come about in the end of the 1920s and early 30s, that just makes things worse, especially for Europe. So we have this declining trade that's going to lead to some pretty serious problems where, it speaks for itself. You see it even in the 21st century. If someone sets up a tariff number and say, hey, we're going to charge you 35% off the top to even sell your stuff here, you can kind of expect the other country to reciprocate that kind of high tariff percentage amount. So it's high tariffs. Maybe you can make an argument that they're well-intentioned on trying to protect local businesses of your country. But in the 21st century, man, we are, as a people, as a human race, essentially, we are so interconnected that it's kind of silly to try to do this. We start seeing unemployment just level up and higher and higher and higher. We're talking almost a 600% increase between Hoover's start of his administration in 29 to when he finally leaves in early 1933. That's probably the worst part of the Great Depression is unemployment, because that leads to a lot of social issues on a very smaller level. Namely, we see suicides going up. We see marriages being canceled, postponed, indefinitely, essentially. Sometimes even just dropped out and canceled as well. We see less kids being born as the population kind of stagnates as well. We see a general lack of hope and a general lack of direction in the country. People are now, for the most part, wondering when the government's going to step in. So the era of laissez-faire is over. 1932 in its election, and really 1933 when FDR officially comes into office and initiates his first 100-day platform of the first New Deal. That's a huge turning point in the country's history. Before 1933, you would have election debates that would center around arguments of, should the government even be involved in the economy? Should the government even be involved in oversight of businesses? Should the government have any kind of say in oversight and just the day-to-day affairs of life in America? After 33, that's no longer the argument. Since then, now we have an argument from both parties of, to what extent should the government have influence over your day-to-day life, and to what extent and how much should the government have power for oversight over the economy and businesses in general. So now it's an issue and a belief on should the government do more or do less, but it's no longer should it do anything. So that's a key component of the Great Depression and this 1932-33 turning point in American history. The general lack of hope in the American people at the time was pretty severe as well. We're talking a proud country who, you look back at the first 30 years of the 20th century, had done quite a bit. We've gotten involved with world affairs. We started to actually fix a lot of our own social problems. We get into World War I, and, for better or for worse, and not necessarily a fair statement, but mostly fair. This idea that America ends World War I, we have these illusions of grandeur that we could go on and solve the world's problems, and we don't even join our own League of Nations that we sponsor and create. So there's a lot of great things that America does, and the 1920s boom in the economy is even a bigger moment in time, I would argue. But you still see a lot of problems that don't get dealt with that end up leading to this massive economic collapse. So people's level of hope, if you could actually measure that and qualify it, just in general, based on diaries that historians have read and general feelings and some of the really sad pictures you have from the early Great Depression, of sometimes parents, it's like one of the hardest things to do as a parent is just say goodbye to your kid. Think about if you were forced to this level of complete hopelessness that you're actually putting up signs outside your house saying, kids free to a good home, inquire within. I mean, it's heart-wrenching. And this kind of this level of hopelessness was becoming rampant in society. So when FDR comes onto the scene and offers an alternative, it's very welcomed. And, let's face it, the Republican Party associated with Hoover and not having done enough, he's not going to win election. The Republicans could have put up anyone, and they probably would have lost. So we see the Democrat Party under FDR come into power with this promise that he's going to try things, and he's going to offer the country a new deal and try to actually implement different plans and policies, and try the key word here, if you haven't caught on yet, new things. Now, I would argue that the New Deal, at its greatest point, is well-intentioned. It does have, sure, you can say some socialist aspects to it, but the country needed something. and Hoover wasn't doing enough. It was the perception. So when you have FDR here saying, hey, we'll try something. I've already talked to all the experts and everything they've told me is wrong. So if there are some other people who want to come up and offer me ideas and say this could happen and this could lead to that, we'll try it. And Congress, for the most part, went along with it. And some of the reforms done were great. Some of the relief that were done, great. Some of the recovery efforts, great. All in all, however, the New Deal does not end the Great Depression, and that's key to remember. As great a movement and time as it was, what really ends the Great Depression is America accepting its place in the world, joining World War II in 1941 after Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and revitalizing the economy, getting people back to work. And that sets in a new turning point for the rest of the 20th century. So knowing that voters already disliked Hoover, FDR, he can run a very safe campaign. There wasn't a lot of, Hoover is going to do this to you. FDR didn't really need to do that. He could talk in generalities. He could talk about hope and use his great rhetorical style and thematic approach to the country and what he saw as what America could be under his leadership and in the future that stirred up people's emotions. So FDR is going to campaign pretty hard for the presidency, but not really run a negative campaign. One of the worst comments that he makes of Hoover, and this is after Hoover really kind of like pushes him into it, he essentially uses the word that we don't really use anymore, but it's referring to, a rooster who has been removed of his manhood, so to speak. And yeah, that's basically the darkest comment that FDR really makes in the campaign. He wants to demonstrate that even his disability, because he had polio, so he's our first legitimately disabled president. Even with polio and him being wheelchair bound, it did not limit his hope and his aspirations and his capability. And voters like that. Voters loved his optimism. They love his confidence. They love the vision of the New Deal and what America could be again. So they're looking for, I would argue, this more active president and a government that is indeed going to have a role in people's everyday lives for the better. So the 1932 election goes quite handily. We're talking, I think it's like a 470-something votes in the Electoral College, 472 here in my notes, to FDR, and only 59 to Herbert Hoover. Popular vote, 57% to FDR versus only 40%, even less than that really, to Herbert Hoover. There are some third-party candidates who get like 2 and 1% of the vote. The Socialist Party gets a little bit of the vote here for one of the first times in American history, basically because capitalism has failed. So there was this common belief, not among the majority, but most certainly a very strong silent minority numbers who felt like since capitalism had failed, maybe we should follow the routes of European countries and embrace socialism, maybe even embrace a fascist regime or something. So take that for what it's worth. There were some questions over the two-party system. There were some questions over if capitalism was meant to be our economic system still after 1932. All right, so that is a 32 election. Hope that helped a little bit with your notes.